We've grown accustomed to seeing history presented as polished myths. But what if I told you that the greatest paradox in the life of Hernán Cortés, whose name is whispered with both dread and admiration, lies not in battles, but in a single, shocking command? An order forever etched into humanity's memory as a symbol of ruthless, almost insane will. Imagine this. You're at the edge of the world, in a strange, hostile land. Behind you, the ocean. Ahead, an unknown empire teeming with gold and blood. And your leader, your commander, looks at the ships, your only hope of salvation, and utters words that chill you to the bone. Burn them, every last one. This wasn't merely a tactical maneuver, my friends. It was an act of pure, unadulterated madness bordering on genius. Cortés wasn't just burning ships, he was burning bridges. He was incinerating the very idea of retreat, the possibility of doubt. He severed the path back for every one of his men. They were trapped. It was either victory or death. No other options. This was a command that screamed, "I am your destiny, and I will leave you no choice but to follow me into the abyss or to the summit." Understand, this was a fundamental statement about the nature of this man, about his unwavering, even fanatical determination, about the fact that for him there was no such concept as defeat, only not yet a victory. This unprecedented step was no random impulse. It was the culmination of what had been forming within Cortés for years, a manifesto of his personality, forged in the crucible of a very different life, long before his foot ever touched the shores of the New World. To comprehend what breeds such ruthlessness, such obsession, such unwavering belief in one's absolute right to power, we must delve deeper, into the very roots of his making. We saw him at the edge of the world, in a strange, hostile land, issuing the command that forever became etched in the annals of history: burn the ships. The only hope of salvation, the only thread connecting them to home, was torn to shreds, left to the mercy of fire and sea. This was not merely a tactical maneuver, nor the madness of despair. It was a culminating act of ruthless, fanatical will, cutting off the path to retreat, leaving only one choice: victory or death. But where did this will come from? What shaped a man capable of such absolute, almost pathological disregard for any defeat? To understand the architect of this relentless resolve, we must delve into the shadows of his youth, into the very roots of his psyche. Hernán Cortés was born in 1485, in Medellín, Extremadura, a land that was itself a harsh and unforgiving teacher. Imagine this region, sun-scorched, dusty, where every stone was steeped in the blood of centuries of wars with the Moors. This was not a wealthy land, not a cradle of refined aristocrats, but rather a forge of character, tough, pragmatic, accustomed to hardship and constant struggle for survival. Here, the cult of strength reigned supreme, and valor on the battlefield was valued above any scholarship. It was in this environment, where the line between hero and rogue was thin, and honor was often measured by the spoils of war, that young Hernán was shaped. His parents, Martín Cortés de Monroy and Catalina Pizarro Altamirano, belonged to an impoverished Hidalgo family, minor nobility whose ambitions often outstripped their means. This created fertile ground for internal conflict. On one hand, the awareness of his noble lineage, granting a right to greatness. On the other, a meager reality, constantly reminding him of limited opportunities. In such circumstances, a burning desire to break free, to prove to everyone, and most importantly to himself, that he deserved more, easily takes root. At the age of 14, his parents sent Hernán to the prestigious University of Salamanca to study law. This was a path to stability, to a career in the bureaucratic apparatus, to a place in the already established hierarchy. But Hernán's soul, it seems, was too vast for the narrow confines of legal codes. He spent only 2 years in Salamanca, showing little diligence and certainly no passion for jurisprudence. What was it? Laziness? Or a deep, intuitive rejection of a system that demanded submission, compromise, playing by someone else's rules? Perhaps he saw in it only the corrupt officialdom he would later so masterfully circumvent and exploit. His willful character, his defiance, was already evident. He refused to be a cog in the machine. He craved adventure, power, gold, everything that could give him absolute freedom and recognition, rather than stuffy offices and endless bureaucratic squabbles. This inner pull towards the unknown, towards limitless horizons, ultimately led him to the New World. In 1504, at the age of 19, he stepped onto the island of Hispaniola, a true cauldron of simmering passions at the time, a place where old rules were crumbling and new ones had not yet been established. Here, among adventurers, soldiers of fortune, and ruthless colonizers, his character was tempered, acquiring the sharpness that made him so dangerous and effective. He quickly adapted to this wild, anarchic environment, learning not just to survive but to thrive, using his charisma, intelligence, and undoubtedly a lack of moral barriers when it came to achieving his goals. Then came 1519. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, who had initially granted Cortés permission for the expedition to Mexico, suddenly changed his mind. Perhaps he sensed a threat, discerning in Hernán's eyes that boundless ambition that tolerates no authority above it. Velázquez attempted to revoke the permission, to stop him. But for Cortés, this was the point of no return. Retreat was unthinkable. He didn't just ignore the order. He acted preemptively. Under the cover of night, in secret from the governor, he departed Cuba, seizing ships laden with supplies and men. This was an act of open defiance, a direct challenge to authority that could have cost him his head. But it was in such moments that Hernán Cortés revealed his true essence, a man who didn't just bend rules, but shattered them if they stood in the way of his grand, dizzying objective. This wasn't a reckless escape, but a cold, calculated move, driven not only by desire but also by a deep understanding of how people work and how they can be manipulated. And that understanding would become his primary weapon in the game he was about to begin in a foreign land, where every move would be a chess match on the brink of life and death. He burned the ships. He cut off the path of retreat. But how could a man who had become an outcast in the eyes of his own governor claim legitimacy? How could he, with a handful of adventurers, challenge an empire without a single official document behind him, save for an annulled order? The answer lies in Cortés's sophisticated, almost diabolical understanding of human psychology and the mechanisms of power. He didn't just destroy. He built new realities on the ruins of old ones, always on his own terms. His first grand scheme, his masterful legal maneuver, was the creation of his own legitimacy. The plan, Cortés, now an open rebel, knew he needed more than just military force. He needed a legal foundation so that his conquests would not be deemed mere piracy, and he himself not executed as a renegade. His ingenious, cynical plan was to establish a city in the new land, proclaim it a municipality, elect his most loyal men to its governing bodies, and then, through this newly formed city council, re-elect himself as the legitimate captain general, authorized to act on behalf of the Spanish crown. This was a direct challenge to Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, circumventing his authority and appealing directly to King Charles V. The execution. On the coast, at a place he named Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, the rich city of the True Cross, Cortés staged his spectacle. This was not a city in the usual sense, but merely a few hastily erected structures, yet in the eyes of the law, which Cortés so skillfully dissected, it was a full-fledged Spanish jurisdiction. He appointed his most fanatical supporters, men whose fate was now inextricably linked to his own, to the Cabildo, the municipal council. And so, in a pre-orchestrated farce, this Cabildo, acting purportedly on behalf of the king, declared that Velázquez's authority in this land was invalid. Then, in unison, they elected Cortés as Chief Justice and Captain General. Now he was no longer merely a fugitive commander, but by his own audacious definition, a direct representative of the crown in these wild lands. The unexpected twist. The true audacity lay not only in the act itself, but in how he made his men believe in this fiction. Many might have doubted, but Cortés, with his magnetic charm and unwavering confidence, as well as the alluring specter of gold, suppressed any attempts at dissent. This brazen attempt to transform rebellion into loyal service, and then to obtain approval from his own puppets, was a risk that paid off, demonstrating his unique ability to bend reality to his will. The consequences. This singular act became the cornerstone of his entire campaign. It gave him the formal right to command, distribute spoils, administer justice, and claim new territories. He definitively broke with Velázquez's authority, establishing, albeit shaky, direct relations with the distant king. For his soldiers, this strengthened their resolve. They were now part of a legitimate enterprise, not just a band of rogues. It was a masterclass in turning lawlessness into a new, self-declared form of legality. But mere legalization was not enough. Cortés, like a predator, sensed weakness and division. His next, even subtler intrigue was a double game with the indigenous peoples. The plan: the Spanish were too few to conquer the vast Aztec Empire alone. Cortés, with his strategic instinct, understood that he needed allies, and he knew where to find them, among those who suffered under the heavy yoke of Aztec rule. His strategy was to present himself not as another conqueror, but as a liberator, a champion of the oppressed, and thereby turn the very structure of the Aztec Empire against itself. He intended to sow chaos and distrust between the Aztecs and their vassals, exploiting their mutual hatred. The execution. Advancing inland, Cortés encountered the Totonacs of Zempoala, a people suffering under the cruel oppression of Aztec tribute, which included gold, food, and most horrifying, human sacrifices for the bloodthirsty Aztec gods. Cortés listened carefully to their complaints, his eyes gleaming with predatory fire. And then the moment arrived. Arrogant and haughty Aztec tribute collectors arrived in Zempoala for their due. Cortés, feigning outrage, immediately ordered their arrest. The Totonacs were stunned, then rejoiced. Their savior had arrived. But Cortés's true genius was revealed in his next step. He secretly freed 2 captured Aztec collectors, sending them back to Moctezuma with a carefully crafted message. He claimed that the Totonacs had acted independently, that he had tried to prevent the arrests, and that he desired only peace and friendship with the great Aztec emperor. The unexpected twist? Moctezuma, the all-powerful, godlike emperor, received these contradictory signals. He was accustomed to absolute obedience. Now his collectors were arrested, but the very man who ordered it was simultaneously sending messages of feigned deference. This psychological warfare was devastating. Moctezuma, already plagued by omens and prophecies, was plunged into a state of uncertainty, unsure who Cortés was, an enemy, a potential ally against rebellious vassals, or perhaps even a divine harbinger. The consequences. The Totonacs, convinced of Cortés's benevolence and strength, became his first and most important indigenous allies. They provided thousands of warriors, invaluable intelligence about the terrain and Aztec weaknesses, and logistical support that was indispensable. For the Aztecs, the incident sowed seeds of distrust and confusion, preventing a unified, immediate, and crushing response against the invaders. Cortés masterfully drove a wedge between the oppressor and the oppressed, creating a fragmented landscape ripe for his particular brand of conquest. The march on Tenochtitlan was no longer just a campaign, but a psychological test. Moctezuma, from his gleaming capital, repeatedly sent envoys with lavish gifts of gold, feathers, and precious stones, accompanied by veiled threats and pleas to return. His intention was clear: to appease these strange, pale-faced men and keep them from his sacred city. But Cortés, with his predatory understanding of human nature, saw this not as an obstacle, but as an invitation. The gold was not a bribe. It was a beacon, confirmation of the unimaginable wealth that awaited him. The plan: Moctezuma, attempting to buy them off, sent gifts. Cortés, conversely, saw this as proof of boundless wealth and the emperor's weakness. His plan was to use this golden lure to trap Moctezuma, exploiting the Aztec ruler's superstitions and seeming indecisiveness. He would not just take the gold. He would compel Moctezuma to surrender himself and his empire, using greed itself as a tool of domination. The execution. Every gold artifact, every precious offering only sharpened Cortés's resolve and ignited the avarice of his men. He accepted each gift with a chilling smile, not as a sign of respect, but as proof of Moctezuma's weakness and the boundless riches yet to be plundered. When finally the moment of confrontation arrived on the great causeway leading into Tenochtitlan, Cortés did not approach as an equal. He entered, a figure of steel and unyielding will, an emissary of a king far superior to any Moctezuma could imagine. The exchange was a dance of power, where Cortés, despite his numerical inferiority, immediately asserted his dominance. He didn't just admire the gold. He demanded to know its source, its quantity, and most importantly, where more could be found. He spoke of his king's insatiable disease of the heart that could only be cured by gold, a thinly veiled threat disguised as a cultural explanation. The unexpected twist. Moctezuma's reaction was perhaps the most astonishing and tragic element of this encounter. The mighty Emperor of Mexico, a figure of divine authority and military prowess, met Cortés not with the fury of a cornered jaguar, but with an almost fatalistic submission. He opened his palace, his city, his very being to the invaders. He seemed paralyzed by a mix of ancient prophecies, chilling awe of Spanish technology, and a profound misunderstanding of Cortés's true intentions. He believed he could control them, perhaps even assimilate them, through hospitality and a yeti display of his own grandeur. He was wrong. The consequences. Moctezuma, in an act of almost unbelievable naivete or perhaps deep spiritual despair, became effectively a prisoner in his own palace, a puppet emperor whose power dissolved with each passing day. His capture, achieved without a single major battle in the capital, shattered the very core of Aztec authority and sowed widespread discontent among his nobility. For Cortés, gold became not just a symbol of wealth, but a psychological weapon, sustaining his men's motivation with the promise of endless riches, while simultaneously undermining Moctezuma's will and the loyalty of his people. This initial bloodless takeover, fueled by greed and psychological manipulation, solidified Cortés's belief in his own unstoppable destiny. At the peak of his power, master of a city teeming with untold riches and a captive emperor, Cortés's arrogance began to swell to truly dangerous proportions. He saw himself as invincible, a divinely appointed instrument of conquest. This intoxicating sense of impunity led to an almost reckless overconfidence, blinding him to the simmering resentment beneath the surface of Aztec society and to the very real threats looming from outside. He believed he had broken the spirit of the empire, that Moctezuma's capture signified the complete subjugation of his people. He failed to grasp the depth of their spiritual conviction, their capacity for vengeance, and the complex web of loyalties and rivalries that still define this foreign world. His arrogance, born from a string of impossible successes, would soon be tested not only by the fury of a betrayed people, but also by the machinations of those closer to home, those who also sought to carve out a piece of this bloody golden pie. And it was in this crucible of escalating conflict that certain key, often overlooked figures would emerge from the shadows, shaping the very trajectory of the conquest in ways history rarely acknowledges. His arrogance, it seemed, knew no bounds, blinding him to the murmurs of a betrayed populace and, far more dangerously, to the shadows gathering behind him. For while Cortés played at being a god in the Aztec lands, far across the seas, intrigues were already brewing that could collapse his house of cards. He was not alone in this game, but his enemies were not idle either. True war, my friends, is rarely fought solely on the battlefield. Far more often, it unfolds in chambers, in whispers behind backs, in frantic letters flying across the ocean. And the main antagonist in this invisible yet deadly struggle for Hernán Cortés was not Moctezuma, but the man who considered himself his absolute master, Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba. Velázquez, whose arrogance and greed matched Cortés's own, was humiliated. His expedition, his gold, his glory, all had been stolen by a daring upstart who dared to challenge his authority and circumvent his direct orders. For Velázquez, this was not just a breach of law, it was a personal insult, a blow to his reputation, to his honor. And such a blow is not forgiven. Velázquez, like a cornered predator, acted calculatingly and ruthlessly. He did not wait for a royal court, knowing how slowly the wheels of bureaucracy turned in Spain. Instead, he decided to give Cortés a public whipping right there in the New World. His methods were direct and brutal. He equipped an entire armada, not for new discoveries, but for the capture and perhaps elimination of Cortés. At the head of this punitive expedition, consisting of 19 ships and over 1,000 men, he placed his loyal but not overly perceptive caballero, Pánfilo de Narváez. The objective was crystal clear: arrest Cortés, return him to Cuba in chains, and seize all his conquests. This was not merely a mission to restore order, it was revenge, planned with cold fury, capable of turning all of Cortés's achievements to dust. But Cortés was not alone either. His genius lay not only in his ability to wage war, but also in his capacity to see and exploit the hidden threads of power running through people's souls. He had his patrons, his allies, often inconspicuous, but indispensable. And the most prominent, the most controversial of them was, of course, Malinche. Malinche, or Malinal, as she was called before baptism, and later Doña Marina. She was not merely an interpreter, as she is often presented. She was a living bridge, a strategic weapon forged from tragedy and extraordinary intellect. Sold into slavery as a child, passed through the hands of various masters, she survived because she was smarter than anyone could have guessed. She spoke several indigenous languages, knew their customs, their myths, their fears. But more importantly, she understood people. She saw Moctezuma's weaknesses. She felt the pulse of the Aztec Empire. She knew where to find cracks in their seemingly monolithic structure. Her role was multifaceted. She not only translated words, she translated meanings, nuances, subtext. She was Cortés's eyes and ears, his unofficial advisor, a psychologist who helped him navigate the labyrinths of indigenous politics. Some historians still debate whether she was a voluntary ally, a prisoner of circumstances, or a woman driven by her own, still not fully understood motives, revenge for the past, a thirst for power, or a pragmatic choice of the lesser evil. But one thing is undeniable. Without Malinche, Cortés would have been blind and deaf in a foreign, hostile environment. She became his shadow, his voice, and sometimes his conscience, or at least what reminded him of the consequences of his actions. And of course, there were the indigenous allies, the Totonacs, the Tlaxcalans, peoples oppressed for centuries by the Aztec Empire, whose lands were exhausted by tribute, and whose hearts were filled with hatred. Cortés, with his animalistic instinct for weakness, masterfully exploited this ancient enmity. He was not a liberator in the usual sense. He was a catalyst who poured oil on the already smoldering fire of conflict. He offered them not freedom, but merely a change of masters, giving them the opportunity to crush their oppressors through foreign hands. Thousands, tens of thousands of indigenous warriors joined him, seeing the Spanish not as invaders, but as a tool for revenge. This was an army that outnumbered the Spanish by tens, even hundreds of times, and without them, without their knowledge of the terrain, their numbers, their fury, Cortés's tiny contingent would have been wiped out. It was a cynical bargain, based on mutual benefit and deeply rooted hatred. And finally, there were those who formed his inner circle, his hidalgos from Extremadura. These men, hardened in the harsh lands where Cortés himself grew up, were bound to him not only by oaths, but by common origin, a shared thirst for gold and glory, and a common willingness to take risks. They were his brothers in arms, men who burned their ships with him, men who had nothing to lose but their lives, and everything to gain. Their loyalty was fanatical, fueled by promises of untold riches and a place in history. They were his fist, his sword, his unbreakable support when all others wavered. They were the ones who ensured his legitimacy, electing him captain general, creating a fiction of legality that allowed him to circumvent Velázquez and appeal directly to the king. This was not just a group of soldiers, it was a conspiracy, sealed by blood, and a shared dream of greatness. Thus, while Cortés held Moctezuma captive, seemingly in control of the situation, he himself was caught between a hammer and an anvil. On one side, a hidden but growing Aztec rebellion, whose patience was wearing thin. On the other, Velázquez's approaching armada, threatening to destroy him from within. It was a chess game on multiple boards simultaneously, where every move could be fatal. And in this game, where the stakes were higher than ever, even the most brilliant strategist could make a mistake. A mistake that would not only cost him his life, but forever alter his destiny, turning the page on his grand yet fragile triumph. He crushed Narvaez, absorbed his army, and then, after the agonizing Noche Triste, returned to grip Tenochtitlan by the throat and strangle it. Cortés had achieved victory, or so it seemed. At the very moment his triumph reached its peak, when the smoke had not yet cleared over the ruins of the Aztec capital, and the gold had not yet cooled in the conquistador's hands, his downfall began. This was not a sudden plunge from a cliff, but a slow, agonizing decline, corroding the soul like acid. The crown, which at first greedily eyed the boundless riches flowing from New Spain, very quickly realized the monstrous power this self-appointed hidalgo had amassed. Charles V, a monarch whose empire stretched from the New World to the Holy Roman Empire, could not permit the existence of such an independent and charismatic leader. capable of conquering an entire kingdom single-handedly. Cortés was too great, and in this lay his main, fatal error. He failed to understand that for a king, nothing is more dangerous than a hero whose triumph eclipses the monarch's own authority. While he fought the indigenous peoples in Velázquez, he was essential. But once Mexico fell, Cortés transformed from an invaluable asset into an uncontrollable threat. And then another war began, far more insidious and dirty than any battle with tomahawks and obsidian swords. A war of intrigues, denunciations, and lawsuits. Envious rivals, aggrieved officials, all those who had been overshadowed by the brilliance of his victories, now emerged from the shadows, armed with quills and grievances. The judicial processes, known as residencias, became a living hell for Cortés. Every decision he made, every act of violence, every ounce of gold extracted from Mexico, was now questioned and accused. The man who burned ships and conquered an empire found himself powerless before red tape and court whispers. He, the great strategist who masterfully manipulated Moctezuma and the indigenous tribes, proved utterly helpless in the labyrinth of the Spanish court. This was his last, fatal mistake. He failed to adapt to the new arena. His genius was honed for brute force and desperate risks, not for the subtle game of flattery, bribery, and bureaucratic delays. He was a lion on the battlefield, but a blind pup in the royal court. Cortés returned to Spain in 1528, hoping to restore his reputation and receive his deserved honors. He was granted the title of Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca and extensive lands, but he was stripped of his gubernatorial authority in New Spain. He, the conqueror, was denied control over his own creation. This was a crushing blow to his ambitions. He felt deceived, betrayed. His subsequent expeditions, including attempts to explore California, yielded only losses and disappointments, failing to discover new rivers of gold or restore his former glory. His final years were filled with bitterness and humiliation. Once all-powerful, he was now a mere supplicant, whose petitions to the king went unanswered. His once vast wealth dwindled under the weight of debts and legal costs. In 1541, he even participated in Charles V's ill-fated expedition against Algiers, but his advice was ignored, his presence barely noticed. The man who had single-handedly conquered an empire was reduced to the role of an insignificant vassal, his time having passed. What went through the mind of this indomitable man in his final days? Cortés died on December 2, 1547 in Castile, in the small village of Castilleja de la Cuesta, near Seville, far from the splendor of the court and the clamor of the lands he had conquered. He likely experienced deep disappointment, the bitterness of injustice and oblivion. Perhaps he was haunted by the phantoms of the past, the cries of fallen Aztecs, the shadows of Moctezuma and Cuauhtémoc, the faces of his lost comrades. He was undoubtedly convinced of his righteousness, that his actions were dictated by God's will and royal service. But even the most convinced fanatic cannot escape the whispers of doubt when triumph turns into personal ruin. Was he broken? Perhaps. But more likely he was deeply wounded, trapped in a gilded cage of titles and lands, deprived of the true power he so desperately craved. His life is not merely a history of conquests, but a stark reminder that even the greatest victories can turn into personal tragedy when ambition clashes with the relentless logic of power. For the story of Cortés is not only about the past, it is a mirror reflecting the timeless, uncomfortable truth about the price paid for absolute power and what happens when that power begins to slip away. And so we arrive at the most unsettling lesson Hernán Cortés's story offers us. This is not just a chronicle of conquest. It is an anatomy of power, cruelty, and human psychology, unfolding through time. His downfall, his endless lawsuits, his death far from the empire he wrested from the grasp of ancient gods. This is not merely an irony of fate. It is a natural consequence for those who build their world on the ruins of others' lives and cultures. Cortés, this master manipulator and ruthless pragmatist, is not unique. He is an archetype. Look around. At politicians who rise to power on a wave of promises, but then methodically clear the field of opponents, rewriting the rules to suit themselves, legitimizing every step through fictions they themselves create. Do we not see in them echoes of that same Cortés who burned his ships, leaving his soldiers only one path, forward, to victory? or to death? Do we not recognize his signature in those who, like him, exploit others' fears and grievances to forge coalitions, only to ruthlessly betray them once their goal is achieved? Or consider the titans of modern business, those who build empires by swallowing competitors, stopping at nothing for monopoly, creating entire corporate cults where loyalty is valued above ethics. Their gold is markets. Their Tenochtitlan is control over resources. Their Malinche is armies of analysts and PR specialists who shape public opinion, turning an opponent's weaknesses into their own strengths. It's the same game, only the stage has changed, and the stakes have become global. And what about those who pull the invisible strings from the shadows? Manipulators capable of inciting conflicts, sowing chaos, to profit from widespread turmoil. Their tools are the same as Cortés's: identifying weaknesses, playing on ambitions, forming advantageous alliances, distorting reality beyond recognition. They don't build empires with a sword in hand, but their influence extends far wider, permeating every corner of our consciousness. The most terrifying aspect of Cortés's story is not his cruelty, but its efficacy. He showed how far one can go when absolute ambition meets unscrupulousness and exceptional intellect. He was a mirror reflecting not only the dark sides of his era, but also the eternal, deep-seated impulses of human nature: the lust for power, the need for control, the fear of being forgotten. And in this lies the uncomfortable question that haunts us through the centuries. What drives those who are willing to step over mountains of corpses, over their own soul, to leave their indelible mark on history, for the sake of absolute power? And can we, looking back at Cortés, honestly say that humanity has changed? Or have we simply learned to hide our fangs behind more civilized smiles, awaiting our moment to once again unleash that same primal thirst for dominance?